The morning of June 4th, 1942, 10:22 a.m., Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky rolled his SBD Dauntless into a 70-degree dive above the Japanese carrier Kaga. The mathematics of war had reduced themselves to this moment. 1 man, 1 aircraft, 1,000-pound bomb, 6 minutes to rewrite history. The Japanese pilots below him had spent 6 months proving a simple fact. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Their Mitsubishi Zero fighters were invincible. Every engagement from Pearl Harbor to the Java Sea had confirmed it. The Zero could outturn, outclimb, and outmaneuver every Allied fighter in the Pacific. American pilots who survived encounters with Zeros described them as ghosts, dancing through formations. Untouchable. But McClusky wasn't flying a fighter. He was flying what the Japanese called a slow, obsolete dive bomber, the SBD Dauntless. Maximum speed 255 miles per hour, the Zero could reach 332. In a turning fight, the Dauntless had no chance. Japanese fighter pilots laughed at American dive bombers. Target practice. Except McClusky carried something the Zeros didn't. 2 Browning M2 machine guns, .50 caliber, forward firing. And those twin 50s were about to demonstrate a truth the Imperial Japanese Navy had overlooked in their calculations. Firepower matters more than maneuverability when you're diving at 300 miles per hour toward a floating bomb magazine. To understand how the Battle of Midway turned on 6 minutes of dive bombing, you must first understand what the Japanese believed impossible: that their carrier force could be destroyed, that the Kido Butai, the sword of the Pacific, could be broken, that American dive bombers, slower and less agile than their fighter escorts, could survive long enough to deliver killing blows. 6 months earlier, Japan had achieved what military theorists considered impossible. The attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, demonstrated naval aviation's future. Carrier-based aircraft, not battleships, would decide the Pacific War. But the attack also revealed something else. American aircraft carriers had been at sea during the raid. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga escaped destruction. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, understood the implications. As long as American carriers operated in the Pacific, Japan's conquests remained vulnerable. The carriers had to be destroyed, not damaged, not delayed, annihilated. By June 1942, Japanese forces controlled an empire. Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, oil, rubber, strategic minerals flowed toward Japan, but the American carriers remained. Enterprise had raided Japanese-held islands. Hornet had launched the Doolittle raid on Tokyo in April. The carriers were needles in a vast ocean, impossible to pin down, impossible to predict. Unless you gave them a target they couldn't ignore. Atoll, a tiny speck of coral 1,100 miles northwest of Hawaii. 2 small islands, Sand and Eastern, surrounding a lagoon. Strategic importance far beyond its size. Naval Air Station Midway provided early warning for Pearl Harbor. Long-range patrol planes based on Midway could detect any Japanese approach to Hawaii. As long as Midway remained in American hands, Pearl Harbor had eyes. Yamamoto's plan was elegant. Attack Midway, force the American carriers to respond, ambush them with overwhelming force. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would strike Midway, then wheel east to meet the American relief force. Behind them, the main battle fleet, including the super battleship Yamato, would close the trap. The Japanese possessed every advantage. 4 carriers against 3, 248 carrier aircraft against 233, 2 battleships, multiple heavy cruisers. The Americans had light cruisers and destroyers. No battleships. The mathematics favored Japan. More planes, more ships, more experienced pilots, and the Zero fighters. Mitsubishi's A6M, When it entered service in 1940, the Zero combined capabilities thought mutually exclusive: long range, high speed, extraordinary maneuverability, and powerful armament. Two 7.7mm machine guns in the fuselage, two 20mm cannons in the wings. Designer Jiro Horikoshi achieved this by radical weight reduction: no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, aluminum alloy airframe stripped to minimum weight. The Zero weighed half what American fighters weighed. That low weight gave it phenomenal performance. It could climb faster, turn tighter, and fly farther than any Allied fighter. Over China in 1940, Zero pilots destroyed 59 enemy aircraft without a single loss. Over Pearl Harbor, Zeros carved through American defenders. Over the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies, the Zero established air supremacy. Allied pilots learned brutal lessons. Never dogfight a Zero. Never try to outturn it. Never let it get on your tail. The Zero's dominance created psychological effects beyond its technical specifications. American pilots believed the Zero invincible. Intelligence reports describing its capabilities were dismissed as impossible. How could carrier-based fighters outperform land-based interceptors? The assumption that Japanese engineering was inferior died hard. The Zero killed those assumptions. By June 1942, Japanese naval aviators believed themselves superior not just in equipment but in skill. Years of instruction, winnowing hundreds of candidates down to dozens. Only the best survived. Those who did formed an elite corps, confident in their abilities, confident in their aircraft, confident in their victory. The Americans had something else, something the Japanese couldn't see in their pre-battle calculations: desperation and intelligence. Commander Joseph Rochefort's Station Hypo at Pearl Harbor had been breaking Japanese naval codes since early 1942. By May, Hypo had partially decoded enough messages to identify the next Japanese objective, a location designated AF. Rochefort devised a test. Midway sent an uncoded radio message claiming its fresh water distillation plant had broken down. Within 24 hours, Japanese radio traffic reported AF is short on water. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew 3 critical facts. The target was Midway, the attack would occur in early June, and he had time to prepare an ambush of his own. The problem was arithmetic: 3 American carriers against 4 Japanese. Enterprise and Hornet were ready. Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea in May, severely damaged. Dry dock repairs would take 3 months. Nimitz gave the repair crews 3 days. Impossible became routine. 1,400 workers laboured around the clock. Temporary patches covered battle damage. Non-essential repairs were deferred. On May 30th, 72 hours after entering dry dock, Yorktown steamed out to join Enterprise and Hornet. On June 2nd, the 3 carriers rendezvoused 350 miles northeast of Midway. The Japanese had no idea American carriers were anywhere near Midway. Yamamoto's intelligence had reported Yorktown probably sunk, certainly out of action for months. The Americans had 2 carriers operational at most. The Japanese approached from the northwest with supreme confidence. The same Nagumo who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. His 4 carriers represented the finest naval aviation force in the world. His pilots had proven themselves in 6 months of combat. His Zeros controlled the sky wherever they appeared. The American carriers waited in silence. Radio. Silence. No transmissions that might alert Japanese radio direction finding. They were outnumbered but not outmaneuvered. For once, the Americans knew where the enemy was. The Japanese did not. At 4:30 a.m. on June 4th, Nagumo launched his initial strike against Midway. 36 dive bombers, 36 torpedo bombers, 36 Zero fighters, 108 aircraft headed toward the atoll in the pre-dawn darkness. Zeros would sweep aside any American fighters. The bombers would destroy Midway's defenses. At 5:34 a.m., an American PBY Catalina patrol plane spotted the Japanese carriers. The message raced back to Midway. Carrier bearing 320, distance 180 miles. Marine fighters scrambled from Midway to defend against the incoming raid. 26 fighters, a mix of obsolete F-2A Buffaloes and newer F-4F Wildcats, young pilots, many with minimal training. They climbed to intercept. The Zeros found them at 14,000 feet. What followed wasn't combat. It was slaughter. The Marine fighters couldn't compete. The Zeros were faster, more maneuverable, better armed. Within minutes, 15 Marine fighters fell burning from the sky. The survivors scattered. The Japanese bombers hit Midway at 6:30 a.m. Hangars exploded. Fuel dumps burned. Anti-aircraft fire knocked down several attackers, but the Japanese formation maintained discipline. They plastered the installations, systematically destroying parked aircraft, command facilities, barracks. At 7 a.m., the Japanese strike force headed back to their carriers. Behind them, Midway burned. But Midway's runways remained operational, and American dive bombers and torpedo planes were already airborne, hunting for the Japanese carriers. Nagumo received the first attack at 7:10 a.m. 4 Army B-26 bombers, modified to carry torpedoes. They came in low over the water, brave and doomed. The Zeros pounced. Japanese anti-aircraft fire filled the sky. 2 B-26 seconds exploded. A third crashed into the sea. The fourth escaped, so shot up its pilot, later counted over 500 holes. No hits on any Japanese carrier. At 7:55 a.m., 15 B-17 bombers attacked from high altitude, 20,000 feet. The Japanese carriers maneuvered violently. The bombs fell harmlessly into the ocean. Level bombing against moving ships at sea proved ineffective. No hits. But those attacks forced Nagumo into a fatal decision. His strike commander radioed from over Midway that a second attack was necessary. Midway's defenses were damaged but not destroyed. Meanwhile, his carriers were launching and recovering combat air patrol Zeros, fighting off American attacks from Midway-based aircraft. At 7:15 a.m., Nagumo ordered his second wave, armed with torpedoes for anti-ship attacks, to rearm with bombs for a second strike on Midway. The arming crews went to work. In the carriers' hangars, ordnancemen removed torpedoes, attached bombs. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese scout plane reported sighting 10 American ships 200 miles to the northeast. Nagumo's blood froze. American ships, this far out. The scout didn't report any carriers, but ships this far from Midway meant the Americans had known, and prepared. At 7:45 a.m., the scout clarified. The American formation included a carrier. Nagumo faced a nightmare. His aircraft were configured for attacking Midway, not ships. His first strike force was returning, low on fuel, needing immediate landing. His Zeros were engaging American bombers, and somewhere out there, American carriers were launching their own strikes. He made the only decision possible: land the first strike force, rearm the second wave with torpedoes, prepare for naval combat. It meant exposing his carriers to attack while his decks were crowded with returning and rearming aircraft. But he had no choice. The Zeros would protect the carriers until the strike force was ready. The arming crews reversed course, remove the bombs, reinstall the torpedoes. Precious minutes ticked away. Meanwhile, American torpedo bombers found the Japanese carriers. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet attacked first. 15 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, obsolete aircraft, slow and vulnerable. They came in at wave-top height, straight and level runs required for torpedo drops, perfect targets. The Zeros fell on them like wolves. One by one the Devastators fell, flaming wreckage scattered across the ocean. Only one TBD survived. Ensign George Gay, shot down, clung to a seat cushion in the water and watched what happened next. 14 men dead, no hits. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 14 Devastators. The Zeros were waiting. Again, methodical destruction. 10 Devastators shot down. 4 survived. No hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed. 12 Devastators. By now, the Japanese Combat Air Patrol had descended to sea level, focused entirely on the torpedo bombers. 5 Devastators were shot down. No hits. Of 41 American torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were destroyed. Only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit a Japanese carrier. The sacrifice seemed pointless. Heroic, tragic, and pointless. But those torpedo bombers accomplished something the Japanese didn't recognize. They dragged every Zero down to wave-top height, and at 10:22 a.m. While the last torpedo attack was ending, 47 SBD Dauntless dive bombers arrived overhead at 14,000 feet. The Japanese carriers sailed in a box formation, Akagi and Kaga to port, Soryu and Hiryu to starboard. Destroyers ringed the formation. Zeros circled at low altitude, finishing off the last American torpedo bombers. On the carrier decks, organized chaos. Aircraft returning from Midway were landing. Rearmed aircraft were being spotted for launch. Fuel hoses snaked across the decks. Ordnance carts stood ready. Not a single Zero patrolled above 10,000 feet. Every Japanese fighter was down low, chasing the torpedo bombers that posed the real threat. Dive bombers, the Japanese believed, weren't the primary danger. Torpedoes could sink carriers. Bombs merely damaged them. The Japanese were about to learn otherwise. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky led 33 SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise. He'd been searching for the Japanese carriers for over an hour, pushing his fuel reserves to dangerous limits. His pilots were minutes from having to turn back. Then McClusky spotted a lone destroyer racing northeast at high speed. The Arashi, returning to the carrier formation after depth-charging an American submarine. McClusky made a command decision: follow the destroyer's wake. Despite his fuel situation, despite the risk, at 10:20 a.m., the clouds parted. Below, McClusky saw 4 aircraft carriers, exactly where the destroyer was heading. The carriers were lined up perfectly, 3 in a column, 1 slightly separated. McClusky's radio crackled. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's 17 SBD Dauntlesses from Yorktown had arrived simultaneously from a different direction. 2 American dive bomber squadrons, 50 aircraft total, all arriving at the perfect moment, undetected, unopposed. The mathematics of aerial combat shifted in seconds. The Zeros were all at sea level. The dive bombers were at 14,000 feet. Japanese anti-aircraft guns were designed for high-altitude bombing defense, not steep dive-bombing attacks. The carrier's decks were jammed with fueled and armed aircraft. One spark would create catastrophe. McClusky didn't hesitate. He selected targets. His squadron would hit Kaga and Akagi. Leslie's squadron would take Soryu. At 10:22 a.m., McClusky pushed his nose down and began his dive. An SBD Dauntless dive bomber attack was precision violence. The pilot rolled inverted, pulled through until the nose pointed at the target, then dove at 70 degrees. Near vertical, the perforated dive brakes, distinctive Swiss cheese patterns on the trailing edge of the wings, deployed automatically. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. They slowed the dive to 300 miles per hour, fast enough to be difficult to track, slow enough for accurate aim. At 14,000 feet, the carrier looked tiny. At 10,000 feet, it grew. At 5,000 feet, the carrier's deck filled the pilot's sight. The bombardier in the rear seat had no view forward. He faced backward, manning the twin 30 caliber machine guns, watching for fighters. But there were no fighters. The Zeros were still down low, unaware of the dive bombers screaming down from above. McClusky centered Kaga in his sights. The massive carrier, 840 feet long, displacing 42,000 tons. Flight deck crammed with aircraft. He could see pilots running to their planes, ground crew scrambling. Someone on Kaga had spotted the dive bombers, but too late, far too late. At 2,500 feet, McClusky released his 1,000-pound bomb. The displacement gear, a steel crutch that swung the bomb forward and down, ensured the bomb cleared the propeller arc. Then McClusky pulled out of his dive, 4 Gs pressing him into his seat. The ocean rushed up. He leveled at 1,500 feet and turned hard left, away from the Japanese fleet. Behind him, his bomb struck Kaga's flight deck just aft of the forward elevator. 1,000 pounds of explosives detonated amid fueled aircraft and stacked ordnance. The explosion ripped through the deck. Secondary explosions followed as bombs and torpedoes cooked off. Aviation fuel ignited. In seconds, Kaga's entire forward flight deck was engulfed in flames. Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, McClusky's wingman, dove next. His bomb hit near Kaga's island superstructure. More explosions, more fire. The Japanese damage control parties never had a chance. The fires spread too fast. Lieutenant Richard Best led Enterprise's other squadron toward Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Akagi was slightly separated from Kaga, maneuvering independently. Best adjusted his dive. At 14,000 feet, he rolled in. At 2,500 feet, he released. His 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck near the amidships elevator. The bomb penetrated to the hangar deck before exploding. The hangar was packed with aircraft being rearmed. The explosion ignited aviation fuel and detonated ordnance. Fire consumed the hangar in minutes. Flames shot up through the elevator shaft. The flight deck, still crowded with aircraft, became an inferno. Admiral Nagumo, on Akagi's bridge, watched his flagship die around him. Within 5 minutes of the first bomb hit, Akagi was burning out of age. Control. He ordered his flag transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. Staff officers helped him down to a cutter. Behind them, explosions rocked Akagi as her ordnance magazine detonated. Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers attacked Soryu simultaneously. 17 SBD Dauntlesses rolled into their dives just as McClusky's bombers hit Kaga and Akagi. The synchronization was accidental. Neither squadron knew the other was attacking, but the effect was devastating. 3 Japanese carriers under simultaneous attack. No fighter cover, no warning, no time to maneuver. Lieutenant Dewitt Shumway's bomb struck Soryu forward. Lieutenant Paul Holmberg's bomb hit amidships. Lieutenant Elmer Hartman's bomb hit aft. 3 hits in rapid succession. Soryu's flight deck erupted in flame. The fires reached her aviation fuel tanks. Secondary explosions blew out her sides. Within 20 minutes, Soryu was a burning wreck, listing heavily, her crew abandoning ship. The entire attack, from McClusky's first dive to the last bomb hitting Soryu, lasted 6 minutes. From 10:22 a.m. to 10:28 a.m., 6 minutes that destroyed 3/4 of Japan's carrier striking force. The Japanese had planned to launch their own carrier strike at 10:30 a.m. Everything was ready. The aircraft were spotted on deck, fueled, armed, pilots in cockpits. 2 more minutes and they would have launched. Instead, those aircraft became bombs themselves, their fuel and ordnance feeding fires that consumed 3 carriers. The twin 50 caliber machine guns on the SBD Dauntlesses played a crucial role beyond their designed purpose. During the dive, pilots used them to suppress anti-aircraft fire. The psychological effect was significant. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, seeing tracers from diving bombers, flinched. Their accuracy decreased. Some dove for cover instead of maintaining fire. During the pullout, those same 50s provided defensive fire. As American dive, bombers pulled out of their attacks and flew away at wave-top height. They faced Japanese Zeros belatedly arriving at altitude. The rear seat gunners engaged with their twin 30 caliber guns. The forward-firing 50s allowed pilots to spray fire at any Zero foolish enough to make a head-on pass. Ensign Frank O'Flaherty, diving on Kaga, encountered a Zero climbing to intercept. O'Flaherty's 50s cut the Zero apart. The Japanese fighter disintegrated, victim of firepower it couldn't match in a head-on engagement. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The SBD Dauntless had never been designed as a fighter killer. It was a scout bomber, intended to find enemy ships and destroy them with dive bombing. Maximum speed of 255 miles per hour made it slow compared to fighters. But those twin 50s, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, gave it defensive capability the Japanese hadn't anticipated. The Browning M250 caliber machine gun was America's standard heavy machine gun. Rate of fire, 750 rounds per minute. Muzzle velocity, 2,900 feet per second. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate aircraft aluminum at 1,000 yards. Against the unarmored Zero, those rounds were devastating. One hit in the fuel tank meant fire. One hit in the engine meant immediate failure. The Zero's design philosophy, trading armor for performance, made it exceptionally vulnerable. Japanese pilots flying Zeros accepted this trade-off. In dogfights, where maneuverability determined survival, the lack of armor seemed acceptable. You survived by not getting hit. The Zero's agility kept you alive, but dive bombers didn't dogfight. They attacked from above, dove vertically, and escaped at high speed. Zeros pursuing them faced those twin 50s in a stern chase. The rear gunner had twin 30 caliber guns. The pilot had two 50s. A Zero catching an escaping Dauntless entered a cone of fire that could shred it in seconds. Lieutenant Norman Kleiss, after bombing Kaga, found himself pursued by three Zeros. His rear gunner, aviation radioman John Snowden, fired bursts at the closest Zero. The Japanese pilot broke off. The second Zero made a high-side pass. Kleiss turned hard, bringing his nose around. His 50s blazed. The Zero broke away, trailing smoke. The third Zero thought better of pressing the attack. Kleiss made it back to Enterprise with fuel tanks nearly dry and over 100 holes in his aircraft. But he made it back. The Japanese, watching three carriers burning, couldn't comprehend what had happened. 6 months of Pacific dominance had ended in 6 minutes. The carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor were dying. The aircraft that had swept Allied forces from the sky over the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies were burning wreckage. The pilots who had formed Japan's elite naval aviation corps were trapped on sinking ships or swimming in burning oil. Admiral Nagumo, aboard Nagara, tried to process the catastrophe. 3 carriers gone, 1 remained. Hiryu, sailing apart from the others, had escaped the initial attack. Hiryu immediately launched a counter-strike. Every available aircraft, 18 dive bombers, 6 Zeros, target, the American carriers. But Hiryu's strike force was a fraction of what the Kido Butai could have launched an hour earlier, and the Americans were ready. Combat Air Patrol Wildcats intercepted the Japanese attack. Anti-aircraft fire from the screening destroyers and cruisers filled the sky. The Japanese pressed home their attack with desperate courage. 3 bombs hit Yorktown. Fires erupted. The carrier slowed, listing. But damage control parties fought the fires. Within an hour, Yorktown was making 20 knots. She launched combat air patrol fighters. She prepared to recover aircraft. Then Hiryu launched a second strike. 10 torpedo bombers, 6 Zeros. They found Yorktown at 4:45 p.m. 2 torpedoes struck her port side. The carrier lost power, listed heavily. At 5 p.m., her captain ordered abandon ship, but the American scout planes had found Hiryu. At 5 p.m., 24 SBD Dauntlesses from Enterprise dove on the last Japanese carrier. 4 bombs hit. Hiryu's flight deck shattered. Fires consumed her hangar. By 6 p.m., all 4 Japanese carriers were burning wrecks. The mathematics had reversed completely. Japan began the day with 4 fleet carriers operational. By sunset, all 4 were sinking or abandoned. America began with 3 carriers, lost 1. But Enterprise and Hornet remained operational, capable of further strikes. The Battle of Midway continued for 2 more days as American aircraft hunted damaged Japanese ships. But the decisive action occurred in those 6 minutes on June 4th, the moment when SBD Dauntless dive bombers, dismissed by Japanese fighter pilots as slow and vulnerable, destroyed the core of Japan's carrier force. The twin 50 caliber machine guns, designed for light defensive fire, proved lethal in ways the designers never anticipated. Against unarmored Zeros, they were deadly. In the hands of dive bomber pilots pulling out at low altitude, they kept Zeros at respectful distance. The Japanese had built the perfect dogfighter. The Americans had built something else. A bomber that could defend itself, a scout plane that could kill capital ships, an aircraft that wasn't superior in any single category but deadly when employed correctly. 6 minutes. 3 carriers burning. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific crippled. The tide of war reversed not by superior technology or numerical advantage, but by timing, intelligence, and the courage of pilots flying aircraft the enemy dismissed as obsolete. The morning of June 5, 1942. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, aboard the super battleship Yamato 300 miles west of Midway, received confirmation. All 4 carriers lost. Akagi scuttled by Japanese destroyers at 5 a.m. Kaga sank at 7:19 p.m. on June 4th. Soryu sank at 7:13 p.m. Hiryu, abandoned and burning, would sink at 9 a.m. Yamamoto's grand strategy to destroy the American Pacific Fleet had destroyed his own carrier force instead. The mathematics that had favored Japan for 6 months inverted in 6 minutes. He ordered the entire fleet to withdraw. The invasion of Midway was cancelled. The trap designed to annihilate American carriers had become Japan's greatest naval defeat. The human cost was staggering but asymmetric. Japan lost 3,057 men, pilots trained over years, maintainers who knew their aircraft intimately, sailors who had operated carriers since their commissioning. America lost 307 men. The ratio reflected the different fates of the carriers. American sailors from Yorktown were rescued. Japanese sailors from 4 carriers died when their ships exploded or went down in minutes. But numbers don't capture what Japan lost at Midway. The 4 carriers represented 6 months of offensive momentum. Every major Japanese victory from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean had involved these carriers. The pilots flying from them had accumulated combat experience impossible to replace. The maintenance crews knew every quirk of their aircraft. The deck crews could launch and recover aircraft in their sleep. All gone, in 6 minutes. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor from Torpedo Squadron 8, spent 30 hours in the water after his TBD Devastator was shot down. He watched the entire battle from a floating seat cushion. He saw the dive bombers arrive. He saw the Japanese carriers burn. American ships picked him up on June 5th, sunburned, exhausted, but alive. He told his debriefers what he'd witnessed, the systematic destruction of Japan's carrier force by aircraft the Japanese fighter pilots had dismissed. Lieutenant Norman Kleiss landed on Enterprise with his fuel gauge reading 0. His SBD Dauntless had 119 holes from Japanese anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks. His rear gunner counted the holes after they landed, 119 punctures, and the aircraft still flew, still brought them home. The rugged construction that made the Dauntless slower than fighters made it survivable under fire that would destroy a Zero. The captured Zero from Akutan Island, recovered intact in July 1942, revealed the truth American pilots had suspected. The Zero was fast and maneuverable but fragile. Test pilots at Naval Air Station North Island in San Diego flew the captured fighter extensively. They documented its weaknesses. At speeds above 200 knots, the ailerons stiffened, making rolls difficult. The float carburetor cut fuel in negative G maneuvers. The lack of armor meant any hit was potentially fatal. Most critically, the Zero couldn't dive as fast as American fighters or dive bombers. The lightweight construction that gave it phenomenal climb rate became a liability in high-speed dives. The airframe couldn't handle the stress. American pilots learned to attack from above, dive through the Japanese formation, and escape at high speed. The Zero couldn't follow. The SBD Dauntless, built for steep dives and high G pullouts, excelled at exactly this tactic. Dive at 70 degrees, deliver the bomb, pull out at 4 Gs, escape at maximum speed at wave-top height. Zeros trying to follow either couldn't keep up in the dive or risked structural failure trying. The psychological impact on Japanese naval aviation was immediate and catastrophic. The sense of invincibility evaporated. Zero pilots who survived Midway flew differently, more cautiously, less aggressively. The knowledge that dive bombers could destroy carriers in minutes changed combat calculations. Fighter pilots had to maintain high-altitude patrols instead of descending to sea level to engage torpedo bombers. But Japan's industrial capacity couldn't replace the losses quickly enough. Building carriers took years. Training elite pilots took years. Replacing 4 fleet carriers and hundreds of experienced aviators proved impossible, while simultaneously defending an expanded empire and continuing offensive operations. America's industrial response was overwhelming. By the end of 1942, new Essex-class carriers were under construction. Pilot training programs expanded exponentially. Aircraft production increased monthly. The arsenal of democracy, as President Roosevelt called American industry, shifted to wartime production with devastating efficiency. Japan had gambled on a short war. The strategic calculation was that America, faced with catastrophic losses and a long Pacific campaign, would negotiate peace. Pearl Harbor was supposed to cripple American will. Midway was supposed to eliminate American capability. Instead, both attacks galvanized American determination. The SBD Dauntless continued serving throughout the Pacific War. It participated in the Guadalcanal campaign, beginning August 1942. Marine and Navy dive bomber squadrons flying from Henderson Field and from carriers provided close air support for ground forces and attacked Japanese shipping. The Dauntless sank more enemy shipping than any other Allied aircraft in the Pacific. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, SBD Dauntlesses participated in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters and dive bombers destroyed over 500 Japanese aircraft in 2 days. The overwhelming American victory demonstrated how completely the balance of air power had shifted. Japan's carrier aviation, rebuilt painfully after Midway, was destroyed again. This time, the losses were irreplaceable. The twin 50 caliber armament on the Dauntless, dismissed as inadequate by some pre-war planners, proved its worth repeatedly. Dive bomber pilots scored numerous fighter kills throughout the war. The 50s gave them offensive capability in encounters with Japanese fighters. More importantly, they provided psychological deterrence. Japanese pilots learned that attacking a Dauntless from ahead meant facing concentrated fire that could destroy their aircraft. The rear gunner's twin 30 caliber guns, often considered the weaker defensive armament, nonetheless scored kills. Aviation Radioman 3rd Class, Bruno Guido, flying with Captain Edward O'Hare, shot down 2 Japanese bombers with his .30 caliber guns. The combination of forward 50s and rear 30s created overlapping fields of fire that made the Dauntless dangerous from any angle. By late 1944, the Dauntless was being replaced by the Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver. The Helldiver was faster, carried a heavier bomb load, and had longer range, but pilots preferred the Dauntless. It was more stable in dives, more reliable mechanically, easier to land on carriers. Many squadrons flew both types until the war's end, and pilots consistently requested the older Dauntless for difficult missions. The Japanese never developed an adequate replacement for the Zero. The A-7M Repu was designed to succeed the Zero, but development delays meant it didn't fly until May 1944. Only one prototype saw testing before the war ended. Japan's carriers, destroyed at Midway and later battles, couldn't operate the new fighters even if they'd been produced in quantity. The Zero soldiered on, increasingly outclassed. By 1944, American fighters like the F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair had performance advantages in every category except low-speed maneuverability. The Hellcat's kill ratio against Zeros was 19-1. The days when Zero pilots dominated the Pacific sky were memories. Many Zeros ended their service as kamikaze aircraft. The Divine Wind attacks, beginning in October 1944, used Zeros loaded with explosives as guided missiles. Pilots, often minimally trained by late war standards, flew one-way missions against American ships. The tactic inflicted damage but couldn't alter the war's trajectory. Japan was losing by attrition, industrial capacity, and pilot quality. The Battle of Midway marked the point where Japan's offensive capability peaked and began declining. Every subsequent engagement saw Japanese forces on the defensive. Guadalcanal, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, American forces advanced steadily, supported by ever-growing air and naval power. The carriers destroyed at Midway were never adequately replaced. American losses at Midway, while significant, were sustainable. Yorktown, severely damaged, was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on June 6 and sank June 7. The destroyer USS Hamon, alongside Yorktown during salvage operations, was also torpedoed and sank. 145 aircraft were lost, 307 men died, but Enterprise and Hornet remained operational. They provided air cover for the withdrawal and continued operations in the South Pacific. Yorktown would be replaced by new carriers already under construction. The pilots lost would be replaced by the expanding training programs. The war would continue. For Japan, Midway was irreplaceable. The 4 carriers couldn't be replaced for years. The pilots couldn't be replaced at all. The experienced maintainers, the skilled deck crews, the command staff who had operated together since before Pearl Harbor, all were gone. Japan would build new carriers and train new pilots, but never again would the Imperial Japanese Navy possess the concentrated striking power of the Kido Butai. The irony was profound. Japan had designed the Zero to achieve air superiority over vast distances. The lightweight construction and long range allowed Japanese forces to strike deep into Allied territory. But those same design choices made the Zero vulnerable to exactly the weapons system that mattered most at Midway. Not fighters engaging in dogfights. Dive bombers delivering 1,000-pound bombs from above. The SBD Dauntless, slower and less maneuverable than the Zero, proved more combat effective when the mission was destroying carriers. The rugged airframe survived battle damage. The dive brakes enabled accurate steep-angle attacks. The twin 50s provided defensive capability. The simple, reliable radial engine kept running despite damage that would have stopped more complex designs. 6 minutes at Midway demonstrated a principle that shaped the rest of the Pacific War. Performance specifications matter less than tactical employment. The Zero was superior in a turning dogfight. The Dauntless was superior in the mission that mattered, sinking carriers. The Pilots who flew those 6 minutes of combat changed history. Wade McClusky, whose decision to follow the destroyer Arashi led him to the Japanese carriers. Richard Best, who put his bomb directly into a Kagi's hangar deck. Maxwell Leslie, whose squadron destroyed Soryu. Norman Kleiss, who survived to tell the story. These men, flying aircraft dismissed as obsolete by enemy pilots, accomplished what battleships and submarines could not. They broke Japan's carrier force. They ended 6 months of Japanese offensive momentum. They created the conditions for American victory in the Pacific, and they did it in 6 minutes, diving through anti-aircraft fire, releasing 1,000-pound bombs onto carriers crammed with fuel and ordnance, then fighting their way home in aircraft the Japanese thought were easy targets. The Zero pilots learned, too late, that dismissing the Dauntless was fatal arrogance. The twin 50-caliber machine guns, the rugged construction, the accurate dive bombing capability, all combined to create an aircraft that didn't need to outmaneuver fighters. It needed to kill carriers. And at that mission, the SBD Dauntless proved itself the most effective carrier killer of the war. The title promised that Japanese Zeros laughed at SBD Dauntlesses until twin 50 cals shredded 4 carriers in 6 minutes. The historical record proves that promise, not through hyperbole, but through documented fact. The Zero pilots did dismiss American dive bombers, right up until those bombers destroyed their carriers in the most decisive 6 minutes of the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.